Bullshit, and welcome to Good News for Armagh. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And today we're going to start at the start, and we're going to have to think about the question, can I believe in God? But before we even get near that idea, and the evidence that there actually is to believe in God, we must spend a little time thinking about what faith is and what it is not. What does it mean to believe or to have faith in God? Now, in our land, faith and religious belief have become somewhat of a dirty word. For us, it's the cause of the troubles. It's a source of division in our society, and for some, faith is backward, outdated, and it should be relegated as a thing of the past. And it's actually made worse by the religious nutcase ringing in Nolan, shouting and complaining, never sounding like they like anyone or love people, but yet they're always quoting the Bible. They always have an opinion. For some, faith unfortunately means bad examples. It means being hit and shouted at and even abused, all the while someone telling you that you're going to hell or God loves you. We don't like faith in our land as a result of all of this, and if I'm honest, I can see why. For others, they actually misunderstand what faith is. Faith for them is believing in yourself. It's to think positively. And if you do that enough, it'll happen. In a recent interview, Morgan Freeman was asked about being a man of faith. And during the discussion, the interviewer actually asked him, what religion or God do you believe in? To which Freeman replied, now I wish I could do his accent here, God? No. Why do we have to believe in a God to have faith? He said, I believe in myself. If you believe enough, it'll happen. Positive thinking, that's what people think that faith is. For others, to have faith and religious belief is akin to closing your eyes and stopping your ears and ignoring reason. You put your head in the ground and you say, I believe. Like, it's irrational for someone to believe in God, they say, because we have been through the Enlightenment, we've had our scientific revolution, and we don't need God now. I wonder if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. There's a scene toward the end where Harrison Ford must make the leap of faith. And he comes to this chasm it's impossible to cross. And his father, like Sean Connery, shouts out, believe, boy, you must believe. And so he shuts his eyes and clutches his heart and sticks out his foot. And he steps out. And he lands on a piece of rock that had been there all along. He just couldn't see it from his angle. That's it, they say. Faith is not needed because the stone there was all along. And we don't now need to look at this world through the lens of faith. So it's fair to say, taking all that on board, that faith is a tricky word. And that whenever the word faith is mentioned, there are many views on what it means. And let's think through this today. Now, we can't obviously deal with all of the issues, but I'm going to take two that we've thought about there, and we'll deal with them. And we'll try to tease out why they're wrong and tease out actually what faith is. So firstly then, if it works for you kind of faith, that's what we'll call it. A kind of, you can believe what you want, and it doesn't matter as long as you're happy and not hurting anyone. That kind of faith. Now, is this right? Whenever you meet someone for the first time, you go through some standard questions like what's your name, or where you're from, or what do you do for a living? And so whenever people ask me this, I always answer, my name's John, and I live in Armagh, and I teach the Bible for a living. Now, cue a tumbleweed blowing across the room. Because as soon as you mention teach the Bible, it's like conversational Marmite. People are either really interested or either really repelled. Now, I try to ease the tension by making some bad jokes like having shares in coffee shops in town, or trying to say, don't worry, I have been certified. They don't generally believe me. But usually the response runs like this. Well, if it works for you, that's great. Now, internally, I usually cringe a little at this, if I'm honest. Because this is actually telling of where we are in our thinking as a society. We tend to place more emphasis on personal experience rather than actual truth, on the individual rights rather than actually what is right. Now, there's a YouTube video, I'll actually put a link in below, where a guy goes to a university campus and interviews people on identity. And he starts off by asking the questions like, what if I said to you I was of Asian origin? Now, he's a white guy. What would you say? He asks. And they respond, good for you. A lot of them actually respond, good for you. I'm kind of like, hold on, what? He's not. The video goes on to ridiculous lengths of gender, ethnicity, and height. Like, you should watch it. In our culture, we place more value on tolerance at the expense of truth, of not offending someone rather than being truthful to them. And so if someone believes, for example, that the tree in their garden is an extension of God and every morning they bow down to it, we stand back and say, that's cool if it works for you. I kind of go, what? Really? Is it not silly? Like, would it not be the loving and better thing to ask a few questions to see how this person came to view this and actually assess their sanity? But that might seem a bit judgy in our society. Now, I believe in freedom of speech, and I believe that anyone, anywhere, should be free to believe what they want so long as it doesn't hurt someone. But does that mean that we cannot believe in the idea of a truth or the truth? Or do we have to step back and say, everything's okay, everything's right? Now, I can't help but thinking to myself, whenever I think about this topic, that if there was a God up there, he would be scratching his celestial head at the prospect of our tree lady. Surely to believe and to have faith, you need to believe in something that is there and is true, not what is personally true to people themselves. So the Bible, in its response to that kind of faith, is actually pity. To believe when there is no basis for it is absurd, Paul says. So, writing about the resurrection of Jesus, he says that if there is no resurrection, our faith is futile, it's empty. And we are of most men to be pitied. Paul says, why believe it? Why practice it? Why teach it if it's empty? If there's nothing to it, and if it's not true, that's stupid to believe it. Just because we feel like it doesn't make it right. It will only have real value to you if it's true. What can that tree actually do for that woman? If she's going through a crisis and she prays to it, what's going to happen? Nothing. You might say, well, I feel good when I rub a crystal or chant to a forest or meditate. Or I have had an experience and I know what I felt. Now, personally, I don't doubt the feeling or experience. I've experienced the spiritual world, but it's not enough. I feel good. Is that the rule of thumb? Or I have experienced this. Like, what if I feel good when I steal something? Is that right? Or what if my experience causes me to have an affair? Does that make it okay? Should we not be basing things on whether they are true or not, rather than what it feels good? And plus, like, if you actually believe that there is a spiritual world out there, both good and bad, would it not be dangerous to open ourselves up to anything without testing what is good and bad? Never mind the feeling or experience. My point is this. What are the foundations for what we believe? Why do you believe what you believe? If you say, that's what I feel is true, or that's what I believe it to be, like, has your feelings ever let you down? Has your opinion ever been wrong? Do we not need to base our faith in what is true, in fact? So that first kind of faith, it doesn't get us very far. That kind of, well, if it works for you kind of faith, it doesn't work. Faith, if it is to be of any use at all, will have to be based in what is factual and what is actual. For Paul, the evidence of the resurrection, for example, was firstly based on the Old Testament, and then from eyewitnesses, also from the lives of Jesus' followers, plus the empty tomb, and then personal experience, which was overwhelming. It was true, so he believed it, and he asks us to. Biblical, evidential faith is based not on what a person decides for themselves to be true, but what is true. And as we go along in this podcast, you're going to see plenty of foundation for Christianity. We will see that it is based in history and in our best understanding of the world. We will see that it makes sense of our intuition and that it works actually in our lives. Secondly, then, faith as opposite to science and reason. I got speaking to a guy recently who told me that he was an atheist. And he was an atheist because of science and reason. And he must have seen my face screw up a little. Because at that point I kind of said, that's funny because I'm a Christian because of reason. At once I could feel actually the cold chill of pity and indifference. So I began to try to explain to him how I came to believe that we were created. And if we are created by and for a personal God, then the most sensible thing and reasonable thing and rational thing was to live for him. Now, that obviously takes more explanation, but we'll get to that as we go along in these podcasts. But if we are made by God and for God, it's very reasonable, in fact, sensible, to live under Him and for Him. So, how do He and I, looking at the same world, having the same science and reason, come to such opposite views? And we need to think a wee bit about this. We're both reasonably intelligent men. So, what is it? And what do we actually say to the world-renowned scientists, like, for example, Francis Collins, who's the former head of the Human Genome Project, who's a convinced Christian? And on the other side, you have Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist and probably the world's most famous atheist, both looking at the same material but coming to opposite opinions. Or take John Lennox, for example, professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's a convinced Christian. And Lawrence Krauss, professor of Arizona State University, who's an atheist. Or, thirdly, take the late Christopher Hitchens. He's the former contributing editor to Vanity Fair, who was an atheist, and C.S. Lewis, professor of English at Oxford University, who was a convinced Christian. How do these people in similar disciplines, similar minds, come to such different conclusions? Well, firstly, we need to see that we're all actually biased. We all come from different backgrounds, some difficult, some nurturing, from different systems of belief, some God-based, some not. We all come with different moral values, some liberal, some conservative, and we are biased. How could we not be influenced by our background? In our experience of life, we are not completely ruled by reason. We're actually far from it at times. So it is sometimes said that people become Christians because of what it offers, like life after death, to see loved ones who have died, forgiveness of sins, freedom of guilt, etc. And so because they have an emotional need for this, they choose to believe it. Now, I'm tempted to say, who wouldn't want this? Christianity is appealing because of what it offers. But for some, what atheism offers is appealing too. On the other side of the coin, for example, like moral constraint, freedom to do what you want, no judgment at the end, no big brother looking over your shoulder. Thomas Nagel, being very honestly, said this. He said, I want atheism to be true. And I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I am right in my belief. It is that I hope there is no God. I don't want the universe to be like that. That's so honest in what he's saying there. Aldous Huxley, that great writer and philosopher, said this. I had bad motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness, that was naturalism, was an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. My point is that we all have bias. Both sides are tainted, both Christian and atheist. But we must try as much as possible to be objective. No matter our bias, find what is true, because faith must be based on what is true. So firstly, we are biased, and we have got to get to the point where we get some kind of objectivity. But secondly, we misunderstand the relationship between faith and proof. Take Mr. Science and Reason earlier, and in this discussion we see the second problem that lies in how we define faith. You see what he did? He put reason and faith in opposite corners. And what he thinks is that a belief in God is the height of intellectual suicide. It is a kind of leave your brain at the door and come on into faith idea, a kind of stick your fingers in your ears and ignore the evidence thing. But why does he think that way? Well, because belief in something means 100% proof of it. So he would say, prove your God exists and I will believe. Now, I think that this kind of thinking is a mistake on two levels. First of all, it is a category mistake. To ask for proof of God is to misunderstand who God is. He is not part of this cosmos. He stands outside it. He is the creator of it, and so he is separate from it. He is transcendent, the theologians used to say, meaning that he stands apart from this world. So to ask proof of God, like you would ask proof of the koala bears in Australia, is to actually ask a very naive thing, according to most of the philosophical world. That is because a koala bear is part of this world, so you can go and investigate and find them, and you would. But what experiment could you set up to find God? Well, you can't. It's an impossible ask. He is not part of our world. He stands outside it. So can you see why saying to someone that they need to prove that God exists before you believe is a naive thing? So it's a category mistake. But secondly, it's an actual mistake. And what I mean is that it doesn't actually work in day-to-day normal life. We don't do life by proof. A senior fellow at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, David Berlinski, he said this. He said, we can make no sense either of daily life or the physical sciences in terms of things that are seen. Now, what he means is that when we do science or just live our lives, we do it mostly by faith, by experiments and experiences that we cannot prove. You see, we believe things in everyday life quite naturally that we cannot prove. For example, think about law court decisions. You can't prove without doubt that all who testify are telling the truth, or that the judge or jury is without prejudice. Can you trust your friend? 100%. Can you prove beauty in art or in music? Like, we cannot prove these things, but we believe in justice, in love. We believe in friendship and in beauty. I cannot prove my wife loves me, but I believe it. I cannot prove that when I leave a job into the shop to be printed that it'll get done, but I believe that it will. I cannot prove that a sunset over Armagh City is beautiful, but I believe it is. Like, is that belief blind or without warrant? Or is there no evidence for it? No. It is because I hear what my wife says to me or see her do to me that I believe. It is because I hear the reputation of the printers is brilliant that I believe. It is because I see the sunset over the lake and it fills me with awe that I believe. Not because there's no evidence, but on the evidence of eyewitness or intuition or by actions or by experience of them. I cannot prove it, but I believe it and I'm fully convinced by the evidence. Can you see why it's naive to ask for proof? Because of who God is and because of what faith is. We all live by this type of belief, even secular people. A man called Charles Taylor said this. He said, secularism is a new set of beliefs, not the absence of belief. And he gives two reasons for this. And firstly, he says, an atheism lives by a set of beliefs, by faith, because they firstly cannot disprove God. So when they live their life making decisions and choices as though there is no God, they're actually living by faith, by a belief. They're betting their life that there is no God. Again, what experiment or scientific test can you use to prove the point that all matter came into existence by itself, that God didn't create the world? An atheist lives by faith because they cannot prove that God doesn't exist. Secondly, Taylor goes on to say that every secular person lives by two major values. Firstly, they believe in equal human rights. That is, that every human is equal in value and dignity. But second, they believe in universal benevolence. That is, that I should be concerned about the poor and the needy, not just in my local community, but everywhere. I should care about all of them. Well, give me scientific proof that all humans are equal. Give me proof of equal rights. We can't. They're matters of faith. Like, do you see that? Even a secular person lives by this kind of faith. What this means is that no one has the moral higher ground. A Christian cannot say, I'm just following the evidence. But you see those atheists? They're just shutting their eyes to the facts. But an atheist can't just say, I'm rational, Christians are irrational. Both positions, Christian and atheists, are a set of beliefs, not proof. In a recent debate, John Lennox was making this point of moral living without proof to Michael Shermer. And Shermer said that it was nonsense. It's not faith to believe in morals. To which John Lennox, tongue-in-cheek, kind of replied, why? Don't you believe it? Human value makes sense if you believe there is a moral God who made humans in his image, giving them dignity and imprinting them with a sense of moral likeness. But it doesn't in a world with only evolution, which teaches that the strong eat the weak, that the weak are weeded out. They are not helped for or cared for. So universal benevolence makes no sense in a world without God. It is a massive leap for an atheist to believe. As one man said, man and apes descended from the same process of the strong eating the weak, therefore love one another. How does the Bible describe faith, though? If there is a God, he has created us. And he created our minds and wants us to use them. And Jesus constantly appeals to the minds of people. Count the amount of references to taught, teaching in the Gospels. Even Mark's Gospel, which is usually said to be the most action-based eyewitness document, it is actually the most repeated word in that Gospel. Jesus taught. Why? Well, because he wanted people to think, to be convinced who he is. And the first commandment and the most important thing God wants us to do is to love the Lord our God with all of who we are, including all our minds. You know, Thomas is a man in the Bible who had many doubts that Jesus was raised from the dead. But he was a twin, you know. And so he knew a little about duplication of bodies. And so he made sure to get the right one. Now, what Jesus did for him is interesting. Jesus gave him evidence. Jesus appeared to him so he could see Jesus, hear him, touch his wounds, smell him, watch him eat. Jesus gave evidence and levels of evidence, not just sight or touch, but all of the above. What Jesus does not do is tell him to close his eyes and stop his ears and just believe, boy, just believe. The opposite is true. He says, open your eyes, listen to my voice. Here is the evidence. Now, the great example of faith in God in the Bible is a man called Abraham. And in Romans 4, Paul tells and describes his faith by using this word, he considered. That is, that he calculated it out. Because biblical faith is a reasoned trust. When the Apostle John is trying to get this across, he actually talks about what we talked about earlier on about trust in people, friendship. I think for a moment of how you come to trust someone. You don't just switch off your mind and lend them your bank card and give them your spare key and welcome the person fully into your life. No, that's being naive. Faith is not or should never be a naive thing. It is a weighing up of the evidence, the keeping of the word, the telling of the truth. This is a considered reasoning. And this is what Jesus taught and what Thomas and Abraham experienced. This is faith. But I will say this, that no one will ever come to believe in God because of reason alone. Because faith in the Bible is always a response to God. As Paul said, faith comes by hearing and hearing by the words of Christ. God reveals himself to people to let them see what is true, and people respond to his voice. So the Bible will rightly speak of faith being granted to people. This doesn't mean that God overrules the person, that they're coaxed against their will. But what it means is that God will enlighten the person at certain points in their life to come to faith. It's like being in a dark room and someone flicks on the light so you can see things clearly. And this is what God can do. And God wants people to come to know him. All people. And maybe you know this by experience. Maybe you're on that journey now. That's maybe why you're listening to these things. Like dots have started connecting in your mind. And you're thinking more about the spiritual things of this world and the next world. Can I just say that is God working, showing you and wanting you to know him. So what is faith then? Faith is stepping over the gap. Sheldon Van Auken wrote a book called A Severe Mercy, telling the story of how he met and lost his wife. It's both brilliant and heart-wrenching. But he recounts how he came to faith. Like he was an atheist and he struggled with this idea of wanting proof. He says this, I began to see a gap between the possible and the proved, and it would take faith to cross it. I didn't want that. If I was going to stake my whole life on the risen Christ, I didn't want there to be a gap between the possible and the proved. I wanted proof. I wanted to be sure. I wanted letters of fire across the sky that Jesus had risen. But then it suddenly dawned upon me that there was a gap behind me too. Perhaps the leap to acceptance was a horrifying gamble, but what if the leap to rejection? I couldn't prove that Jesus was God, but I certainly couldn't prove that he was not. This was not to be borne. I realized that I could not reject Jesus without that great step of faith. But then I began to realize that I could not go ahead without that great step of faith. There was only one thing to do once I saw that the gap behind me was every bit as big as the gap before me to Jesus. This is the issue, the gap before the God and the behind to reject God. Faith is a stepping across the gap. Listen, not like Indiana Jones did, eyes closed, working it up in himself, but as Thomas did, with all his senses involved in the evidence, like looking at the evidence, and we have been given evidence. And you must make the choice and you must make the decision. It is a gap that you will step across. And this is what this podcast is all about. Seeing the evidence to step across. We're going to look at what God has left for us, like the levels of evidence, not in the greatest detail, but enough to get you started. And if you dare, you can ask God to help you, to show you, and then you have the ability to decide whether the gap is greater before or behind, and you can make the choice. Thank you for tuning in, and I really hope that you've enjoyed it and found it helpful. Next week, we're going to start building up the levels of evidence that God has left for us to start narrowing this gap. We will think about that just before the start of everything. How did it all begin? By God or by natural forces, by chance or by nothing? Tune in next week to think together through the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. Slán go fóill.